Hey everyone, this is a brief introduction to the work of Shoji Hamada and Peter Voulkos, both artists that had a strong attachment to and underlying dedication to the aesthetics of wabi-sabi. So let's get started. Shoji Hamada was a Japanese potter who's best known for his loose stoneware style of pottery and glazing, and you can see here the kind of like loose brushwork that he used from simple and humble tea bowls, as you have created, to hand-thrown pottery. Here's a Temaku example with rutile and others, but all very loose applications. There's nothing particularly fussy about it, and his techniques of dripping and pouring glazes is very much in the Japanese tradition, also from China and Korea as well. But the work is, as you can see, just incredibly beautiful. And all these glazes have long traditions in China, Korea, Japan, but specifically in the stoneware traditions of Japan. Early on, he met Bernard Leach, and this relationship was to be one that was very telling and a strong influence on Hamada. Leach, they met in 1919 when both were young men, but Leach had been born in Hong Kong, even though he was a British individual. He was born in Hong Kong and lived much of his life in both China and Japan. He is known as the father of British studio pottery. He also wrote the book A Potter's Book, which was published in 1940, and at the time it was one of the only books on ceramics that was in print, and it was also considered one of the most helpful. And in it, he promoted, and the book still promotes, ethical pots, what he quoted as ethical pots, which have an emphasis on handmade, sort of soulful human process and function, as opposed to factory-made pots, using machines which were in vogue at the time, and also which was becoming vogue, which were slick kind of art pots. And the book also, as you might consider as we go along, strongly influenced the counterculture of the 1950s and 60s. Anyways, Leach and Hamada had a lifelong friendship. Leach saw pottery as a combination of art, philosophy, and craft, even as a kind of greater lifestyle, which he shared this idea with Hamada. And both perhaps had as enduring outcomes of their lives that they promoted the common aesthetic values that were shared by both the East and the West. In 1920, Hamada accompanied Leach to St. Ives, England, and stayed there for 3 years, helping him establish pottery. They were both young, and they both had this idea that pottery was important. After 3 years, Hamada then returned and set up his own pottery in Japan, where he used only locally sourced materials, traditional processes, and, for example, hand-dug clay, historic glazes, handmade tools, etc. And in this process, which was in stark contrast to the trends of the time, was to be factory-made and machine-made. In this process, Hamada protected the Japanese stoneware tradition from basically extinction because nobody was doing it anymore. As a result, he was designated later a national living treasure in Japan in 1955, and his home is still a museum for that reason. He also became noticed and then friends with Sueto Yanagi, who was a prominent art critic in Japan and the curator of the Japanese Folk Art Museum, and the founder of what was called the Mingei movement in Japan, which had to do with folk traditions and maintaining folk traditions. So these three individuals, Yanagi, Leach, and Hamada, continued as powerhouses through the 50s and 60s in promoting what was then like not really a big deal. Everything was modern, but to promote handmade things, to promote things that had a soulfulness and showed the human touch. And they also took their show on the road. They decided, okay, we're going to go take this other places. They went other places in Asia, other places in Europe, and also in the United States. This is both West Coast and East Coast, and had many interactions and conferences and work times with universities and craftsmen. And one of these places was in Helena, Montana. And here they are, again, on the far left, Bernard Leach, the tall guy in the back, and on the far right, Hamada. And the guy with his hands on his hips is Peter Voulkos. And Peter Voulkos became one of the most prominent ceramic artists of the 60s, 70s, 80s, because he became known as a groundbreaking abstract expressionist using clay as his medium. His story is that he was raised in Montana, and he, as a young man, was in World War II, and he fought in the Air Force and flew bombers over Japan, dropping bombs, and then returned on the GI Bill, attended Montana State University, and later went and did a residency in Helena, Montana, at a old dilapidated brick factory owned by this fellow, Archie Bray. And in Helena, this place is still there if you ever get a chance. It's one of the most sort of well-known art meccas for ceramic artists. It's not an old beaten-up factory anymore. It's pretty slick, as you see here. But when Voulkos was there, it was pretty much beaten up, and there was only a few of them there. But he was this amazing potter. He'd learned to do it. He'd learned it at Bozeman by taking a class his last semester as something he thought he'd never do. He'd never thought clay was any part of it. He thought of himself as a painter. And he started making pots. And here at the Archie Bray, he made these amazing traditional pottery based on, the traditions that he knew and the techniques that he knew and stoneware. And it was incredible work, but pretty tight and pretty potterly and pretty functional. And that was great. And he was became a rock star there at the Archie Bray Foundation. He was actually in this picture. Look up Rudy Audio too. He's a pretty famous artist himself. But they're playing guitar, and evidently Voulkos was quite a dramatic flamenco guitarist back in the day. But he also became known as the rock star of pottery. And here's a bunch of people from New York that people would flock to the Archie Bray Foundation because things were happening there, and Peter Voulkos was part of that. And you could, in one of the women with the shawl on is a pretty famous ballerina, I guess, from New York. And there's a writer and several other individuals that are from the New York art scene. So that's something that went on in Helena, Montana. And in the midst of this, there were visitors. The visitors came from Asia and from England. It was Yanagi, Bernard Leach, and Shoji Hamada that came and gave a workshop. They were doing workshops all over, but they also visited Helena. And in that process, a 3-day workshop happened in which this was the result. Hamada worked, and Voulkos was his apprentice because he was the resident there, the resident artist. And so the tradition in Japan is that residents make the clay and kick the wheel and clean the tools of the master. And so that's what Hamada was making work, and Peter Voulkos sat and watched him work for 3 days straight. And that's what happened. That was the long and short of it. He watched him make and decorate pots like this and apply slips and glazes like this, which he'd never really seen before. I mean, we didn't have the internet back then. People didn't know. And so he started to instantly change his work and take liberties with pots and change and alter them and paddle them. And they didn't need to be perfect anymore. And he could push through them and alter them. And then he went and studied in Oakland. And he studied and taught in L.A. And then he, for most of his career, was a professor at UC Berkeley right here as a homie. And he learned and was acquainted with some of the most influential artists of the time, like Jackson Pollock, the abstract expressionist whose work is known as applying paint in the same way that the Japanese would apply glazes, by dripping and drooling and pushing and prodding, and ended up with very animated action images. And here's a kind of like a diagram of the way he worked, and his thoughts about his work, and the profundity of his work, and the sheer volume of it. You can find it at almost any of the major contemporary museums these days as a marker of what was happening in the 1950s and 60s in America, and as this, really important art form, abstract expressionism. Also, within this were other artists that influenced Voulkos, like Helen Frankenthaler, who had a completely different take on the same process of approaching the canvas and applying paint and showing an action, showing human activity. But she did it in a different way, and the results, as you can see, are very different. The way that she... the end result is from a different persona. It's from a different personality, and it just is so obvious. And that's kind of the point of abstract expressionism. And lastly, of these same people, completely different personality, Franz Klein approached the same way of working abstract expressionism, having started as a more classically trained painter, knowing how to render the human figure, but his was one to show action. I have to show action and human motion. And when you added color into it, you got these incredibly beautiful images of human activity, of human existence, as the critics would call it. Well, Peter Voulkos vibed on that same thing and started doing it in clay. He started looking at clay as a canvas to push and prod and to poke through and to carve on. And what he did was take clay from a medium that you made pots with and turned it into a medium that you made art with. And this wasn't lost on New York critics, who thought, this is really cool stuff. And this medium actually lends itself, perhaps as well as any medium, to this idea of abstract expressionism, which is the American model of art in the world now, which, when I'm saying now, I'm talking the late 50s and 60s, through to maybe the early 70s. But Peter Voulkos was right in the middle of that. And he started doing these things called stacks, in which he vigorously would use the wheel. He returned the wheel and would make parts on the wheel and then stack them up and cut them and carve them and put them together like a sculptor using maybe other materials that were stacked, but he was using clay. And each of these had the, almost a life cycle of an individual in them. They were representative of a sort of like intense meeting of a human being with reality, with all the things going on in one's life and all the implications of that. Anyways, here's some of his pieces. They were not only made in clay, but they were also then cast and made in bronze. So I guess later in life, one of the morals of this story about Hamada and Voulkos is that later in life, Voulkos asked by art historians what had been the strongest influences of his work. And it was assumed by them, these New York critics, that his close association with the avant-garde artists and thinkers of the time, specifically abstract expressionists, that was it. That was what was the most important thing that had influenced him. He acknowledged this, but his response was a surprise to everyone, and that is that it had been his encounter here with Hamada, watching this man make these beautiful, simple, and expressive and elegant art pieces which had begun here at the Archie Bray Foundation in 1952. So his association with Hamada changed both men, but I think it changed also art and the world. And I think it's important for us to understand how significantly both of them represent this concept we've studied of wabi-sabi. That's it. Goodbye.